The UH-60 Black Hawk helicopters participating in today's flyover are from the Bravo Company 1106 Aviation, based out of the Illinois Army National Guard Aviation Facility in Kankakee, Illinois. Chalk 1 is crewed by Chief Warrant Officer 5 Herb Stevens, Warrant Officer 1 Vasily Genescu, and Staff Sergeant Rob Danielle. Chalk 2 is being crewed by Major Garrett Leffelman, Chief Warrant Officer 3 Brian Lozzi, and Staff Sergeant Tim Panetera. The Illinois Army National Guard is proud to provide today's flyover. We now ask all veterans to salute and everyone to please remove their hats for the singing of the national anthem by Rock Falls High School student Aaliyah Haynes Penny.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Thank you, Aaliyah. We will now have the opening prayer by Chaplain Gordon.
Let me bow our heads. Almighty God, our Heavenly Father, with reverence and love, we pause to pay tribute to our honored and valiant Vietnam comrades. There were over 58,000 who paid the ultimate sacrifice, and those over 1,200 still unaccounted for. Grant that we may ever be mindful of their service to God and country. Hallow their graves. Give courage and comfort to those having suffered the loss of a loved one. Watch over the graves of our comrades, granting eternal rest to their bodies and peace and happiness to their souls. Keep them into the hour of final reveille, that day when they are called before the divine commander. May all of these men and women be present and accounted for. May their souls and the souls of all departed veterans rest in peace. Amen.
Now, if all veterans would stand. We thank you for your service. You may be seated. So I'd like to give some thank yous out. We want to thank all of our sponsors that helped to put on this event, and they are listed as here. They're businesses here in Sterling Rock Falls: Johnson Oil, South Valley Bank, Holiday Inn and Express and Suites, Arthur's Garden Deli, Candlelight Inn, CGH Medical Center, Community State Bank, Northern Illinois Cancer Treatment Center, Samuel Metal Spinners, Selmy's Greenhouse and Farm Market, and Sterling Federal Bank. Along with those, I'd like you, if you have a program, we'd like to acknowledge all the people that helped and did donations and worked, and they are listed on the back of your program. Also, I want to thank all the committee members that helped to plan this. We've been working on this since January, and we've had monthly meetings, and in the last 2 months we've had bi-weekly meetings down to weekly meetings. A lot went into this, and I couldn't do it without everybody's help, so I thank all the committee members. And now I'd like to introduce Melanie Canensi and Kendra Hall, who will read the names of Vietnam veterans' names of which are on the wall.
Good evening, and thank everybody for being here. I'm a little short, sorry. We'll begin with Whiteside County. John Anthony Prombo, Harry Arlo Amsbury Jr., Michael Dennis Brightman, Jerry Zaletti, Alvin James Diamond, Ricky Lee Doy, Dennis Keith Eads, Dale Henry Gibson, David Arthur Gray, Douglas John Hahn Jr., Lawrence Eugene Howard, Aaron Gilbert Johnson, Stephen James Kelly, Leonard Wayne Knox, Gary Allen Luttrell, Hans Lothar Mills, John R. Naughton Jr., Jack Edward Searing, Stephen Charles Sellett, John Marshall Smith, Glenn Allen Tompkins, Daniel Robert Troy. Now for Lee County. John Michael Babbage, Dennis Eugene Dawson, Patrick Martin Dixon, Melvin Vernon Levin, Roger Allen Scarborough, Leroy Clyde Shaneberg. And now for Ogle County. Roger Lee Batt, Brian Eugene Campbell, Norman Jean Cates, Richard Allen Cheek, Louis Wayne Frericks, Delbert Eugene Hall, Charles Edward Haslip, Donald Merle Hendricks, Arnold Edward Johnson, Donald Maurice Kretzinger, Larry Allen Mackey.
John MacArthur Page.
Arthur Gene Richardson.
James Edward Rimmer.
Harmon S. Stone Jr.
Richard Lee Wilkerson.
And a total Illinois state casualties was 2,929. Thank you.
Now I'd like to introduce Doc Russo. He's the manager of the Vietnam Traveling Memorial Wall.
First, do we have any Gold Star families here tonight? You can just raise your hand if we have any. If we do, thank you for your sacrifice. We love you. That's why we do what we do. Melinda, it's been a long 16 months. Is it worth it? If she's happy, we're all happy. They asked me to talk a little bit about the wall. And I can tell you it's a 3/5 scale replica. There's 58,281 names on it. We travel from April to November. We do about 18 months a year. But what I like to do is I like to tell a little story that lets you guys know why I do what I do. Years ago, I was in a little itty bitty town in West Virginia in the mountains. Literally one street, no red lights, no stop signs. We were set up in a high school on the front lawn like every little town. There's a house off to the side, a little old lady sitting in a rocking chair. I call her Grandma. She reminded me of Grandma. But I bet you she could tell you the name of every person that came to that wall that weekend. Sunday night, at our closing ceremonies, I noticed Grandma was sitting down in the chairs. I thought it was pretty cool that Grandma finally came to visit after 4 days. We went through with our whole closing ceremonies, and after the ceremonies, I was just mingling in the crowd. All of a sudden, I get a tug on my shirt sleeve. I turn around, and it's Grandma. She says, "Excuse me, are you Mr. Doc? You the man that brought this wall to my town?" I said, "Yes, ma'am, I am." She says, "Well, I want to thank you very much." She goes, "No, you don't understand." I was like, "Oh, I pissed off Grandma. That's not good." She grabs a hold of my shirt sleeve again, and she totes me over to the east side of the wall, and she points to the name. She said, "This is the first time in 47 years my son has been home. I don't need another reason."
Good evening. My name is Robin Blackert, and I'm the City Administrator of the City of Rock Falls. I would like to thank someone tonight who would never take credit for everything that is happening here right now. Melinda Jones is our Director of Tourism, and about 1.5 years ago, she came to the mayor and I and said, "I want to bring the Vietnam Wall here." And we both said, "Absolutely." So let's all take this time to thank Melinda. So I am so pleased and grateful that I have the opportunity to introduce our speaker this evening, which is my brother. Dan had already graduated from high school and was out of the house by the time I was born. But soon his distinguished military service, his professional achievements as an attorney, and his commitment to civic organizations soon became the yardstick by which I measured my own life and still strive to achieve. So I'm proud to introduce my brother, retired Army Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Corbin.
Can you hear me okay? Robin, thank you for inviting me to speak here tonight. It's a real honor to be back here in the county in which I was raised. I was raised on a farm outside of Linden, Illinois. For many people, the Vietnam War is a distant memory. For most of you, all you know about the Vietnam War is what you've read in the history books, what you've seen on TV or in the movies. Let me give you a brief history of the Vietnam War. The involvement of the United States spans not just a few years, but goes all the way back to World War II. In the later stages of World War II, the OSS parachuted advisors in to advise Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh to fight against the Japanese. The OSS was the forerunner of the Central Intelligence Agency. The Viet Minh were the communist-inspired nationalist movement fighting against the French for their independence. France had colonized Vietnam back in 1887. The Viet Minh, after World War II, continued to fight for their independence from France. And the United States, because of the fact that they were communist, supported the French. President Truman approved $10 million and established a defense attaché office at the embassy in Saigon. And then when the Korean War broke out in 1950, he sent 123 non-combat service members to Vietnam to help supervise the millions of dollars that we were funding the war against the communists. In May of 1954, the Viet Minh they soundly defeated the French at a place called Dien Bien Phu. A peace plan was agreed to. The United States and China and Russia and other countries were involved in the peace plan. And North and South Vietnam were divided by a demilitarized zone. The peace plan called for there to be a reunification election, and all the military people who fought against France, the Vietnamese, were supposed to stay, if they were in the north, in the north, and if they were in the south, in the south. And those Viet Minh soldiers south of the demilitarized zone became the Viet Cong. And the Viet Cong continued to fight for reunification and elections. And the elections were never held because although the peace plan was agreed to, it was never signed. On July 8, 1959, the first two American advisors were killed in Vietnam. In 1961, President Kennedy sent 400 U.S. Army Special Forces to Vietnam. In February 62, President Kennedy established the Military Assistance Command Vietnam. all of us Vietnam veterans know that as MACV. Later that year, the spraying of herbicides and defoliants began and continued for 19 years until 1971. Many of us veterans in Vietnam have felt the consequences of Agent Orange. At one of our Vietnam Veterans of America meetings near Fort Hood a few years ago, someone from VA asked, how many of you have had cancer? And about 60%, including me, raised their hands. And someone piped up, yeah, there's a lot of us, but a lot of us have already died and can't raise their hands today. By 1963, the number of U.S. advisors in Vietnam had increased from about 900 at the inception to 16,000. On November 22nd, 1963, most of us don't remember, but I certainly do, President Kennedy was assassinated. And the Vietnam War became the problem of President Johnson. In 1964, there was an incident in the Gulf of Tonkin where North Vietnamese gunboats allegedly fired on U.S. naval vessels. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution authorizing the President of the United States, without any declaration of war, to use whatever force was necessary, short of nuclear force, to fight and retaliate against the North Vietnamese. In March of 1965, the bombing of North Vietnam started, and 3,500 Marines were deployed from Okinawa to Da Nang. By 1966, the troop strength had risen to 385,000, and it eventually peaked at 549,000. To give you all some sort of an idea of what the scope of that was, the peak strength in Afghanistan of troop strength was 98,000. And the peak troop strength in Iraq was in 2007 at 170,000. In August of 1969, President Nixon began the Vietnamization of the war, where things were to be turned over for the Vietnamese army to lead the fight. On March 29th, 1973, the last U.S. combat forces were withdrawn from Vietnam. March 29th is on the calendar every year as Vietnam Veterans Day. It's on the calendar, but it's not widely celebrated, unfortunately. After the U.S. troops were withdrawn in 73, Congress withheld funding for the South Vietnamese Army, and they were eventually defeated by the North Vietnamese. On April 30th, 1975, Saigon was captured and renamed Ho Chi Minh City. In addition to the 58,318 American servicemen killed in Vietnam, over 150,000 Americans were wounded. There were 766 POWs. 114 of those POWs died in captivity. President Nixon officially ended the war by proclamation on May 7, 1975. That's a brief history of the Vietnam War. Could those of you who served in Vietnam please stand to be recognized? Thank you for your service and welcome home. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial is located in the National Mall in Washington, D.C., not far from the Lincoln Memorial. It's the most visited memorial in the District of Columbia. More than 5 million people visit each year. Veteran Jan Scruggs was the founder and president of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund, which was vital in getting the wall built. The foundation began their fundraising efforts in 1979, and 3 years later, on Veterans Day, the Vietnam Wall was dedicated. It was designed by Maya Lin, and the key element of her design was a shiny black granite wall in a wide V shape. It continues to be a symbol of enduring legacy, healing, and education for those of us Vietnam veterans. The two 200-foot-long sections that make up the wall contain the 58,318 names. One section is directed toward the Lincoln Memorial, and the other part of the V is directed toward the Washington Monument. There are 70 separate panels that make up each section of the V shape. The veterans' names are listed in chronological order by the date of their death and begin and end at the center. The Vietnam Traveling Wall Memorial that we have here today is a 3/5 scale of the memorial in D.C. This traveling memorial that we have here today stands as a reminder of the great sacrifices made during the Vietnam War. It allows people the opportunity to visit the wall who are not able to make the trip to Washington. I'll tell you a little bit about my tour in Vietnam. After I graduated from Linden High School in 1965, I joined the Army and worked as a Spanish linguist in Panama for 3 years. After graduation from Engineer Officer Candidate School in 1969, I was commissioned in military intelligence. I attended 8 months of Vietnamese language school, jungle school, and some intelligence courses, and then I was assigned to the G2 section of the 101st Airborne Division in Vietnam. After my 1-year tour in Vietnam, when we arrived in the state of Washington at the Air Force Base near Seattle, we were told not to travel in our military uniforms. There was no cheering in the airports, no parades, no welcome home ceremonies. On my first visit to the wall, like many Vietnam veterans who visit the wall, I had some specific names that I was looking for. I was looking for 3 names. Some people look for many more than that. But I was looking for the names of 3 soldiers I knew who had been killed in Vietnam. You heard one of those names read, Michael Brightman. He was my brother-in-law. He was raised on the Fenton slab and was a graduate of Erie High School. He was handsome, he was athletic, everyone liked him, and the girls adored him. After graduating from college, he joined the Peace Corps. Spent 2 years in the Peace Corps, and after that he enlisted in the Army and went to Artillery Officer Candidate School. After his 1-year tour in Vietnam, he extended for an additional 6 months instead of going home. In late 1969, when I was in Engineer Officer Candidate School at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, that time I was married to Michael Brightman's sister, Deidre. And she and our infant daughter, Elizabeth, lived in an apartment in Woodbridge. And actually, as an officer candidate, I was living in the barracks at Fort Belvoir. Got a emergency message from Red Cross. I was pulled out of class, told that Deidre's brother Brightman was missing in action. The helicopter he was in had gone down. So I called Deidre and told her that I had a pass. She was very suspicious of that because we never had a pass. And asked her to pick me up. Earlier that week, I'd received orders for 8 months of Vietnamese language school, so my next assignment was pretty clear. We went to her apartment and I told her about her brother. It was just awful to give that news to anyone. He was missing in action for many months. Their dad couldn't take it and died of a heart attack while they were waiting when he was missing in action. When I visited the wall, I found Michael Brightman's name on panel 16 West, line 7. The second name I was looking for was the name of Thomas Dolan. My first job in Vietnam was flying as an aerial observer in the back seat of an O-1D Bird Dog, which is a single-engine, fixed-wing, 2-seater, 1,400-pound, tiny little aircraft. Had a 2.5-hour mission in the DMZ in the morning, land, refuel, eat something, and get back in for a 2.5-hour mission in the Ashaw Valley. During these missions, I took pictures with a 35mm with a telephoto lens. And when I started, I had a reservoir of courage. But every afternoon, when the green tracers started coming toward our aircraft, a little bit of that courage was depleted. And finally, after a particularly horrible mission, it was gone. When I took the job, the G2 told me that it was strictly voluntary, and as soon as I had enough of it, I just let them know and they'd get somebody else to take my place. But they wanted all the intelligence officers to get familiar with what our area of operations looked like from the air, so that's why we were forced to volunteer. You all know, Army veterans understand about volunteering, right? After that particularly bad day, I knew that I could no longer climb into that plane, so I went to the G2 and unvolunteered. Little did I know that my next job was to be with the 101st Airborne Division Tactical Operations Center forward at Quezon, and then it would be far more dangerous, and I would not be able to unvolunteer. After I met with the G2, he walked out of his office and announced that he was looking for a volunteer to replace Corbin in the Bird Dogs. And a young man named Thomas Dolan volunteered. About 3 months later, his aircraft went down in an area near the DMZ that was seeded with cluster bomb units. He was missing in action for over a year. I've struggled with survivor's guilt, which many of us Vietnam veterans struggle with. Why did we live? I self-medicated on alcohol, like many of us did. Finally, through the grace of God, I was able to realize that God had a plan for me that did not include dying in that little airplane. I was able to accomplish a lot of good things during the remainder of my tour in Vietnam. I was able to accomplish a lot of things as a lawyer. I helped a lot of people. As a public servant on the city council and mayor of Killeen, which is a town in central Texas that's a little larger than Davenport and Rock Island combined. I was able to accomplish a lot of good things and get a lot of good funding to help us with our military base at Fort Hood. When I looked for Thomas Dolan's name on the wall, I found it on panel 3 West, line 127. The third name I was looking for on the wall was Jim Sawtelle. I first met Jim in jungle school in Panama before I went to Vietnam. Jim was a snake eater. He was an airborne ranger. So he was assigned to L Company 75th Ranger Battalion in Vietnam. He was a lieutenant, a great leader. For the last few months I was in Vietnam, I was the G2 operations officer of the 101st Airborne Division. And the Ranger Company was under the operational control of the G2 operations officer, so I gave them their intelligence collection missions. The G3 operations officer, as a major, wanted to use 3 of my Ranger teams in an ambush operation in the Ashhaw Valley, and I argued against it, but he went up the chain of command, and I was a lieutenant, he was a major, and I lost. All the veterans understand that. It turned out to be a catastrophe. It was written up in the VFW magazine a few years ago. 3 helicopters were shot down and a lot of people were killed and wounded over a 3-day period. And I was told that Jim Sawtelle had been seriously wounded and had died. When I went to visit the wall, I found out that his name was not on the wall. He had survived. I was glad his name was not on the wall. I wish there were no names on the wall. Your presence here today, the hundreds of you here, honor those who died in Vietnam in service to our country. Thank you for coming today.
Thank you very much. We will now have the 3 volleys salute.